Hello, folks. Welcome back. Second show of the day. I hope you enjoyed the earlier show about the mine clearing. That was an amazing one. Some brilliant explanations about the science of mine clearing, along with some incredible stories of personal bravery. But if you remember back the show we did last Tuesday with John Parshall, we talked about these 300 plus books that have been written on El Alamein. There's probably been half a dozen new ones since I started hosting these shows 2 weeks ago. But one of my now indispensables is written by today's guest. The other book, Neil Barr's book, he hasn't been a guest this week, but James Colvin is going to be with us now, and he wrote this really good book here, Eighth Army versus Rommel. The links to purchasing it on the description below. And if you would like one more El Alamein book for your library and you don't have it, I would thoroughly recommend going out and getting it, because it just sets the scene. And that's what we're doing tonight, folks. If you remember that conversation we had earlier in the week or last week about when do you start talking about the Eighth Army? When do you start talking about the Battle of El Alamein? Well, that's what we're doing. We're going back and framing it with this whole idea of where did the doctrine come from? Where did the leadership come from? How did it evolve? What were the lessons were learned? And so on and so forth. So I shall bring my guest in now. So James Colvin is, as I say, wrote this incredible book. He's a historian and he's waiting in the wings now. So good evening, James. How are you today?
I'm fine, actually. I'm very, very pleased to be here, and thanks for asking me.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you're here, and I hope you heard that nice praise of your book. But it is the eternal question, isn't it? Is when do you start talking about El Alamein, and you know because the leadership that was involved, the changes in doctrine had been a long time in the making. So before we bring up your PowerPoint and we get into it, when you wrote your book, what was it you were trying to bring to the table? What was, as we said, 300 plus books on it? What were you trying to set straight?
Well, really, it was. I had a connection with this Desert War, and my father, a cousin, and an uncle were all there, and they were all very reluctant to talk about it. It was not something they could communicate to other people who hadn't actually been there, and that really is why I went. I wanted to find out for myself just what had happened and why. And I think really, looking at it in detail, the army seemed to be so dysfunctional at every level at some point in the campaign that there had to be some reason for that. Why not just go back to the original documents, have a look, and see what comes up? And it was absolutely fascinating. I found the research mind-blowing in the stuff that you could uncover. And it started off really as I aim to sort of try and recover some academic reputation by getting a decent degree. I did a military history degree with the University of Buckingham. It started off as that. I discovered very early on that I'm not of an academic bent, and my essays were thrown back at me with considerable violence. So having done quite a lot of research, I thought, well, keep on doing it. And eventually I just thought I had enough to actually perhaps interest a publisher, which, thanks to Helion, I find I had. So that really is the way it came.
Well, brilliant. And the thing is, as we've talked about, is that as Brits, we are burdened with so much mythology and iconography about this battle. As it comes back to the bagpipes through the minefields and those Pathé reels and the War Illustrated that came out at the time, is that sometimes you got to strip away all that and go back and actually look at the archives and work out how it was fought from those who were there. So anyway, we'll bring up the PowerPoint on screen. So we'll do questions kind of as we go along tonight, folks. I can assure you, having seen what we're going to be talking about, it's going to be a very thorough, comprehensive talk. But of course, we welcome your comments. We welcome your questions as we go along. But essentially, James is going to tell me when to nudge on the PowerPoint, and we'll move through this really extraordinary conversation. So the war in the Mediterranean, the war in North Africa, over to you, James.
Well, this is a look really at what went wrong with the Eighth Army in the summer of 1942. And I think one needs to have this look, because without it, you can't fully understand why Montgomery, with his back to basics message, was, in my view, so necessary. Those of us who caught John Parshall's incredibly illuminating talk on the Eighth Army from an American point of view, his theme of, if you can't do combined tactics, then at least use a lot of artillery, was a refreshingly straightforward approach. And thankfully means I don't have to wade through Operation Lightfoot and stop at Alam Halfa, pretty much. What I'm aiming to do is not give a blow-by-blow account of the Desert War, but to look at a few specific operations to see how British armoured doctrine and tactics developed from 1940 through to 1942, and some of the reasons it found or did not find solutions to the problems it faced. If I was a vicar taking a text for a sermon on 8th Army's tactical development, I would go for a comment made post-war by Auchinleck's Chief of Staff at Alamein, quote, "There was something wrong with us, not just our tanks." And Dorman Smith actually put his finger on what it was that was wrong. The issues were cultural and social as much as military. But the result was that by mid-1942, the British Army was only partway up a steep learning curve as far as armoured tactics were concerned. Even after nearly 3 years of war, it still lacked a uniform doctrine of armoured warfare. In fact, doctrine was a word hardly used by the army. The Commander-in-Chief in the Middle East at the outbreak of war, General Wavell, a renowned trainer of troops in the 30s, didn't even acknowledge the word and discounted the idea of principles of war, saying leadership in war was all simply common sense and instinctive to the properly trained soldier, a comment that begs a huge number of questions. Germany, on the other hand, had faced land enemies throughout the previous century and evolved a doctrine that, among other things, emphasized flexibility, speed, surprise, aggressive action, and summed up in the word Auftragstaktik, the initiative and independence of the lower commander, translated nowadays as mission command. In North Africa, their capacity to learn from experience and to adapt to new circumstances was far superior to that of the British. In 1938, British troops in Egypt had been formed into the 7th Armoured Division, led by Major General Percy Hobart, a leading proponent of armoured warfare. He was a firm believer in the ideas of Little Hart and Fuller, seeing mobility, flexibility, and capacity to concentrate rapidly from dispersed positions as the positive characteristics of tanks. He was adamant that these characteristics would be diluted if tanks were obliged to coordinate their actions with less agile, unarmoured wheeled vehicles. He accepted the need for some infantry, perhaps a battalion and some artillery, as protection for armour when refuelling and at night, and to provide what he called a pivot of manoeuvre from which armour could operate, but no more. This led to a disagreement with the C&C of British troops in India, who was a firm believer in all-arms cooperation. Hobart's uncompromising attitude resulted in his dismissal, but his principles of tank-only units lived on among the tank fraternity. Do we have a slide of Operation Compass, in fact?
The first specific map we've got is Battle Axe.
Okay, fine, right. 7th Armoured Division's first actions of the war were against the Italians and outstandingly successful, even allowing for the inefficiencies and poor leadership of the Italian forces. And a useful pamphlet was printed on the lessons learned. Chief among these was the insistence that the force commander must be at the point of decision. A warning about appalling lack of wireless security made clear that the Germans would have punished the weakness, and it emphasized that armoured units must work with artillery support and with an infantry unit for dismounted action. There was no reason to continue believing that unarmoured troops would cramp the style of armoured units. Unfortunately, 7th Armoured Division was almost immediately dispersed when in February 1941 the operation concluded and personnel went either on leave or to meet the Germans in Greece, and these recommendations were never circulated. So due to the demands of other operations, it was very much a scratch force that met Rommel's first attack, no more than a territorial infantry battalion and 26 very tired tanks, plus another 50 or so captured Italian tanks that proved worthless. They attempted to halt Rommel at Alamein, which is the left-hand village on the map. They were hustled out of that position, and in the confusion, the corps commander, the divisional commander, his staff, and crucially, Richard O'Connor, the architect of the victory over the Italians, were captured, ensuring that the lessons of the previous campaign would not be disseminated. Sorry. The Germans moved up from Alamein, as the opposition devolved. They aimed to take Tobruk, were frustrated in that, and halted on the frontier between Libya and Egypt, where Brigadier Gott, the commander of a mixed force, skirmished vigorously with whatever troops could be got together before withdrawing to a safe distance. Under pressure from Churchill, who sent a convoy of tanks and aircraft to assist, an operation named Battle Axe was launched in June 1941 with instructions to defeat Rommel's field army and relieve Tobruk. It was a conspicuous failure, and this map was produced to absorb the lessons of Battle Axe and identify what had gone wrong. This was in one of the first documents I looked at when I began the research, and it actually just leapt out at me as thinking, gosh, here's the real evidence of what actually happened. And going back to the primary documents, you really do see, it really unties the puzzles in your mind, and it gives you a very clear idea of what you're likely to find and how you should just persevere and persevere until you find it, actually. This map always reminds me of the opening credits of Dad's Army. In fact, it's the black arrows, rather menacing on the left, are the German armored troops coming down to frustrate the English, whose rather cautiously advancing arrows are on red, green, blue, and yellow. The red represent the British infantry. Their objective was to capture 2 points through the escarpment to free up traffic along the coast roads. One at Sollum, which is the top right village, and another about a little bit further down at Halfire. Rommel had reinforced the garrisons of these 2 points with 88mm guns, and the Matilda tanks who were assigned to this task found they made very, very little progress indeed. The blue arrows are the, beg your pardon, the green arrows show the moves of the heavily armored infantry tanks. The blue are the more mobile medium tanks of 7th Armoured Brigade, who seek out the German positions with a view to engaging in a firefight. And as you can see from the direction of the arrows, their success is somewhat limited. The yellow arrows down at the bottom are the support group containing the division's infantry and artillery, and they appear to play no part in the battle at all, skirmishing rather aimlessly on the flanks of the German advance. The operation lasted a couple of days. The British lost half their tanks and a few hundred men. The Germans basically suffered minimal losses indeed. But it was a great disappointment for the powers that be, and resulted in the wholesale dismissal of the senior officers of the force.
Just a quick question for you, James.
Yeah.
You talked about the commanders that went off to Greece, and it came up with Glyn Harper, and I think it may have come up with Craig Tibbets as well. What a pointless campaign that was. But in terms of the learning of techniques in the desert, how much did that loss of the Greek chapter just add to the lack of momentum of improvements of what's going on in North Africa? Do you think it was a pivotal moment in that they just took their foot off the pedal and lost a bit of momentum?
Oh, absolutely, without question. The pamphlet that was produced following on from the success of the Italian campaign, it had all the good stuff in it. One of his recommendations was that the British wireless security was absolutely abysmal, and one of the lines in the pamphlet included the words, "Had we been fighting the Germans, the results would have been very different." They made no alterations to their systems, took no greater care in covering up their movements. When Battle Axe was launched and Rommel and his intelligence section were listening in, they must have been laughing over their breakfast when they heard exactly what the British forces were planning to do. Listen to the disagreements and the divisions that emerged between the 4th Armoured Brigade with the heavy tanks and the 7th Armoured Brigade with the fast cruisers, and the way in which they were unable to cooperate with each other, and consequently these really menacing sort of black arrows diving down the flanks, cutting through the middle. They were lucky the entire force wasn't caught in the net. So yes, the diversion of troops to Greece, or diversion of personnel, meant that these lessons were simply lost.
Yeah. Thanks.
Nonetheless, the battle had been quite a severe shock to Rommel, especially as some of his troops were already demoralized by the ferocious resistance they'd found at Tobruk. He sacked some of his commanders, he replaced his chief of staff, and in exchange got one of the pioneering specialists of armored warfare, General Cruel, and embarked on a retraining process for the Italian infantry, and celebrated with the German infantry who'd held out behind the 88mm guns. And you can imagine there's Rommel in the middle. Pastor Bach, the chap on the right, is a retired clergyman who actually sort of conducted the defense of the Hellfire Pass and was laden with plaudits for that. And it rather looks as if they've been sort of sampling a few captured crates of British beer there as well. It's not a pleasant place, a picture of Rommel. You don't often see him like that. He's, for once, not posing for the camera. He did pose for the camera extremely well. You have to give him that.
True.
The failure was a great disappointment to the British and resulted in a wholesale change of command. Waver was replaced to C&C by Claude Auchinleck. The charismatic Gott, who was still a charismatic figure despite the ineffectiveness of his support group, was promoted to take over 7th Armored Division, and his highly esteemed colleague, the aggressive Jock Campbell, the tall chap in the middle of the picture, was promoted to brigadier and took over the division's support group. Auchinleck is the man on the right, very, very agreeable man, slightly constipated in his dealings with people, not very expressive, buttoned up, very typical of his time. He was not a great communicator, very decent chap and strong character. But clearly there were some lessons to be learned from battle axe, even if they'd missed the lessons from the Italian job. Firstly, on the rapidly changing battlefields, they worked out that the commander of the operation must be present in person in the field. At the time of battle axe, he had been assigned, he'd gone to the RAF headquarters 60 miles from the front, and with wireless communications of the day being what they were, he had absolutely no control over what was happening, and nor was he properly informed as to the situation. And air support systems were developed that were going to improve for the next operation, and within a year were going to be instrumental in actually punishing the Axis forces. They realized also, they learned also that it was impossible to combine infantry tanks, the heavy Matildas, with the cruisers, the Crusaders and similar ones, their particular roles of assault and exploitation not being interchangeable, thanks to the differences in speed and armor protection. But British command still underestimated the tactical abilities of German troops. And for example, on seeing the mass movement of 70 or 80 German tanks in a single body, dismissed them as over-regulated and stereotyped maneuvers, which could be countered by more mobile and fluid action. The fact that the German army was often, and after battle axe invariably, accompanied by infantry, artillery, and anti-tank guns went unnoticed. Furthermore, the vital importance of secure wireless operations had not been absorbed, and British armour had attacked German anti-tank positions with inadequate artillery support and without any infantry for dismounted action. The support group commanded by Gott and holding 7th Armoured Division's organic artillery and infantry had operated entirely separately from the division's armour, and on observing German armour moving in a coordinated mass of 70 tanks, failed to recognise battle drills for what they were, describing enemy tactics as rigid and rather stereotyped and slow to adjust to altered circumstances. In the 7th Armoured Division War Diary, there's a paragraph on this, and quote, "In every case, when met with determined and resolute opposition, and in spite of their superior numbers, the enemy have given ground before our tanks and guns. The Germans display a lack of maneuverability in their actions, and for this reason, the enemy does not have the same effect with his large masses as we should had we similar numbers." And statements which are wrong on absolutely every count. Gott blamed his failure with his support group to inflict serious damage on the shortage of armoured cars to locate the enemy. His view on combined arms was that artillery's role was to harass enemy armour as it formed up, but intervention in a tank versus tank battle is not their role, as tank regimental commanders would be too occupied to give the necessary orders. Gott was a charismatic figure, capable of charming almost all who met him, and it was he who took over command of 7th Armoured Division that autumn. By then, the division seems to have reverted to Hobart's principle of separation of the arms, recommending that, like crabbed age and youth, unarmoured and armoured vehicles do not go well together, even less so in the desert, and the division's 2 armoured brigades next went into action with only an infantry company and 1 field battery each to support their 3 tank regiments. The bulk of the infantry and artillery was concentrated in the support group whose role was to occupy country unsuitable for armour, to form jock columns, which Goddard pioneered and through which Campbell had made his reputation, company-sized tactical groups designed to raid enemy supply lines and to work in conjunction with armour rather than being integrated with it. And then next slide, please. The 8th Army got into action again in November, heavily reinforced and full of confidence. Its plan to meet and defeat the Afrika Korps, then relieve the siege of Tobruk and drive Rommel out of Cyrenaica. Training and planning have been limited by late arrival of the new 1st Armoured Division, and the death in an air crash of a newly arrived Armoured Corps commander resulted in last-minute delays and disagreements. Gott had been promoted to command 7th Armoured Division, and his support group now under Jock Campbell, and the Armoured Corps, comprising both 7th and 1st Armoured Divisions, was under Willoughby Norrie, a competent leader but lacking desert experience. During the planning that autumn, the desert veterans among the infantry division commanders insisted they needed an armoured brigade for close protection during the forthcoming offensive, although Norrie was equally certain that armour must remain at all times concentrated, and was in any case sufficiently mobile to come to the infantry's aid if need be. He was unable to override them. Thus, 8th Army launched their attack in November on a poor footing, with 1 of its 3 armoured brigades detached from the main thrust to cover the infantry divisions. Even worse, another armoured brigade, keen territorials new to the desert, launched an enthusiastic charge at the Italian Ariete Armoured Division and its guns at Birgubi, which is, you probably see Birgubi on the map, just below the top of the right-hand arrow,
Yep.
and was badly punished, leaving only the 1 remaining armoured brigade and the divisional support group available to take the Sidi Rezegh airfield and its surrounding escarpments, the essential first step to relieving Tobruk. There followed an immensely complicated series of encounters between the 2 armies, neither Rommel nor the British 8th Army commanders distinguishing themselves as tacticians, the Germans showing more cohesion and tactical competence, and the British tremendous determination and persistence. In the end, British material superiority began to tell. Their attacks by small mixed columns and Axis supply lines exhausted the enemy, and after nearly 3 weeks, Rommel was obliged to call a retreat. Even then, it was not a rout, the Afrika Korps turning and hitting back, 8th Army merely following up the Panzer Corps rather than trying to cut it off, as Rommel had the Italians the previous year. Indeed, as fresh armour arrived, Rommel struck back so hard that the novice 2nd Armoured Division had to be deployed to make up for losses. This aroused a comment from Air Marshal Tedder, a very, very competent, bright man, and who saw the army units for what they were. He said, well, the success so far has been a triumph of brawn rather than brains, and now they've thrust a novice division up at the front line. You must expect another disaster, he telegraphed back to London. The enemy struck back in January, routed the entire force, pushing them. Next slide.
Yep.
Pushing them back to a defensive line at Gazala, shielding Tobruk. I'm sorry, I've lost my place.
It's no worries. I just want to remind people we did a great show about Sidi Rezegh a few months ago with Peter Cox when he was talking about his father's role there. So that was a really good one. If you haven't seen that one, folks, go back and find that one. I'll add the link to it when we finish this one. But yeah, really brilliant so far. And yeah, so let's move on.
It was a wholly unnecessary defeat and extremely damaging, not just in material terms, but in the mistrust it bred in the frontline troops for the higher command. Morale was based mostly on the regiment, and that remained good, but among all ranks in the front line, there was widespread doubt about the judgment of their superiors. Next slide.
Yep.
Auchinleck had replaced the army commander during the Crusader operation with his own chief of staff, Neil Ritchie, and against advice kept him in post even after the very untidy conclusion to the battle. Ritchie was more of a staff officer than a commander and was junior, younger, and less experienced in command than his subordinates. Gott now promoted even further to command the infantry divisions that comprised 13th Corps, and Norrie commanding the armour divisions of 30 Corps. Auchinleck persisted in keeping a close eye on Ritchie, which tended to undermine his authority, which he in any case sometimes failed to fully exert, relying on a consultative method seemingly based on the syndicates through which students at British Staff College were taught. And not only that, but Auchinleck himself was thought to be under the influence of another staff officer, Brigadier Eric Dorman Smith, highly intelligent and ambitious, a convinced follower of the Littleheart and Fuller School of military philosophy, and considered a maverick and widely distrusted. Below this strata of senior officers looking warily at one another, there was a divergence of views among the divisional commanders. Lumsden of 1st Armoured Division, slide, blamed Major General Messervy of the 7th Armoured for the defeat in January, disputed his training methods, and proved reluctant to cooperate in action. Next slide.
And we had a comment earlier on the sidebar about Auchinleck not being a very good appointer of officers. Would you agree with that?
Well, they didn't work out terribly successful. That's for sure. I mean, one problem was that he was an Indian Army officer.
Yeah, that came up.
And the Indian Army was considered, without any real reason, to be somewhat inferior and amateurish compared to the British Army. They were good and bad in both, but there was a divergence of view, social and cultural as much as anything else. If you joined the Indian Army as an officer in the 1930s, you could afford to live in your pay in quite a good lifestyle. In the British Army, you certainly could not. So the British Army tended to have people who came from a somewhat wealthier background than the Indian Army themselves. This is certainly true of Auchinleck. His widowed mother sent him to the local school in Northern Ireland, and he did very well from there. But he wasn't. He was badly connected with the British Army Officer Corps, and there's always this reserve that they had towards Indian Army officers unless they proved themselves to be exceptionally good. So he tended to bring the people he knew and liked from India to serve under him. Dorman Smith, I mentioned before, was one, and he appointed a totally useless chief of staff called Tom Corbett, who's a frightfully nice chap, absolutely hopeless, and almost comically bad, actually. But he stuck with
And we
it.
should just point out that your book, the first big chunk of it is just about this old boy network, the school system, the culture, the class, that Alan Allport has written about so extensively as well. And I think for those who are watching who aren't British, those American viewers or Dutch, European viewers, whatever it is that this was something that was both a burden for the British Army. It was also the backbone. It was some kind of paradoxical. There were the benefits of this old system was tradition, I suppose, and continuity. And then the downsides were there were these officers that were just not up to the job. So before we move on to sort of a quick answer to the question, how influential do you think this whole cultural tradition in the British Army had been in creating this group of officers that we had in 41, 42?
Oh, I think it was absolutely central. And the average British school was about the same size as the average regiment in the British Army, and was divided into houses, which was a company-size sections. It was heavily, games were prized above a great deal else. Character was the thing that they aimed to develop. Ideal military material, really, absolutely ideal in principle. Unfortunately, it was inwardly looking. They were competitive with each other between regiments as between schools. There was a social strata among the regiments. Guards and cavalry at the top, the line infantry at the bottom, artillery somewhere in between. Artillery distrusted because they were rather bright. They went to Woolwich College rather than Sandhurst.
You have to know their maths, don't they, in the artillery? That's the thing. You got to know angles and trigonometry, and that's not for the cricket types, is it?
Absolutely right. Yeah, you don't need that in football. I mean, it is comical, really, but it is also very, very damaging.
Mm.
You can go overboard. The resilience of the British Army was a thing that actually was really bloody good. I mean, they went through all sorts of traumas and came up smiling pretty much, not out of habit, but because they'd been drilled to do so. And if you didn't smile, you weren't a proper chap anymore. But after the retreat to Alamein, for example, not many armies could have actually gone back in such a shambolic rush and reformed and fought successfully. So you have to give them credit for that. But at the regimental level, they were extraordinarily good. Above that, the flaws showed dramatically, I think.
Yeah.
There we go. Anyway, after the Crusader operation, the retreat back to Tobruk, manning the Gazala line, which extended about 50 miles in the desert, about 40 miles from Tobruk, and shielded Tobruk from artillery fire at least. There was a certain amount of heart searching about what had gone wrong yet again, and unfortunately, most of the plans for reforming the tactics were, the senior officers could not agree on which to adopt. Gott was promoted now to command the infantry divisions that comprised 13 corps, and Norrie commanded the 30 corps armour divisions. Auchinleck persisted in keeping a close eye on Ritchie, which tended to undermine his authority. And his consultative method of leading turned out, and in the end, to be something of a failure. Beneath the strata of senior officers looking warily at one another, there's a divergence of views among the divisional commanders, Lubsden falling out with Messery. The situation was worsened by the fashion, in the name of flexibility, of switching brigades from one division to another so that they could be under commanders unfamiliar with their methods. The armour division support groups, for example, now rechristened motor brigades, retained the role of forming jock columns, but now also had to provide so-called pivots of manoeuvre and boxes on which the armoured brigades could formate. The system was not consistently adopted and was used more in defence rather than to support attack. The account suggests it worked well in one of 30 Corps' 3 armoured brigades, badly in another, and not at all in the third. Forming and reforming boxes was described by one practitioner as very muddling. The infantry in 13 Corps under Gott was not a united crew either. The Northumberland division, newly arrived, was sound enough, but of the 2 South African divisions, the second was new to the desert and wholly inexperienced, while the first was commanded by Dan PNR, notoriously awkward and not always compliant with the wishes of British commanders. He and his family, like other senior South African commanders, had as children spent some time in British concentration camps, which probably put them off the British to a degree. Hello? Oh, fuck. Now, what the fuck has happened here?
Good.
Are you there?
I'm here. Yeah, I'm here. You've got me.
Well, I've lost the picture completely. Have you got sound? Can you hear me?
I've got sound. I can see you. I can see everything. Yeah.
Well, I've got a Microsoft Edge help and learning. No idea what's happened. Oh, there we are. Sorry about that.
No worries. I've got you.
Yep. The infantry divisions were assigned garrison duties either in Tobruk or behind minefields, manning the 40-mile length of the Gazala line, protecting the town, together with the 5th Indian Division when it arrived. And next slide, please.
Yep.
Got that one. Planning and training in the spring of 42 centred on avoiding an early clash of armour, instead blunting an Axis armoured attack with prepared infantry and artillery defences, with more and larger boxes, and then counter-attacking with tanks. This idea of boxes was extended beyond the tactical to the operational level in the plan for an offensive against Rommel. This is a map of Operation Buckshot, the map I think on which Auchinleck was working in the spring of 1942. It's not that easy to decipher, but you can see the bulge of the coast, and you can see where Tobruk. The sort of focal point in the middle of the desert apparently comprises the Martuba airfields, which were vital in the maintenance of Malta, and were at this point in the hands of the Germans. Auchinleck was under instructions to recover them rapidly because the Maltese situation was becoming critical. And the plan that he devised was to advance along the coast road, in steps, step by step, until he actually reached Derna, the town right up on the top, and from there to actually destroy any Axis forces which remained in the airfields. This Dorman, looking in on one of the planning sections, Brigadier Dorman Smith, who had a kind of floating role as a sort of senior advisor for Auchinleck, was contemptuous of this concept of advancing steadily along the coastal route, taking minimum risk. Exasperated, the intelligence officer, Freddie de Gangond, asked him what he would do. Dorman Smith picked up half a dozen counters and laid them on the map, saying he would establish a series of brigade manned boxes across the desert at 30 or 40-mile intervals and continue until he reached Agadarbia, which is a town in the bottom left-hand corner of the map. And that distance is for several hundred miles. You can see de Gangond made a satirical comment on the scheme, describing the trail of brigade boxes as cowpats. But it became the plan adopted, and the term cowpat or pat became common usage in 8th Army. You can see the little circular rows at 15 or 20-mile intervals across the sort of left centre of the map. And it does seem a rather odd way of planning an offensive. In May, it was clear from Ultra that Rommel's attack was imminent, and in a flurry of activity, the motor brigades of the armoured divisions were themselves installed in defensive boxes rather than preparing to work with their armoured brigades in a mobile role. On the evening of the 26th of May, Rommel's advance began. It was observed and tracked throughout the night by British reconnaissance units, but bizarrely there was very little British reaction to their reports. The map actually is overly detailed, but it's reasonably clear if you work it out. You can see where Tobruk is behind a perimeter. Yep. From Gazala, there's a 40-mile line of minefields going down to the Free French Brigade, 1FF Brigade. Rommel aimed to bring his entire force round there, sweep up behind, destroy the armour somewhere in the middle, and then take Tobruk all within 4 days. His plan was, on the face of it, was lunacy, but perhaps he knew his enemy better than most might have. The armoured divisions are based. 4th Armoured Brigade is the central unit of 7th Armoured Division. 22nd Armoured Brigade is the main unit of the 2nd Armoured Division. As you can see, they're separated by 20-odd miles. Their support groups are in the little second one, 7th Motor Brigade, 29th Indian Brigade, and 3rd Indian Brigade. Those basically are their support groups, and they are operating at the outset of Rommel's offensive, completely out of touch with the armoured brigades. You couldn't really find a sort of more absurd way of disposing of your forces. The reason for that was that Auchinleck was convinced there was going to be an attack either in the north, or the seaborne landing, or through the centre. Reich was convinced the attack would come in the south, as indeed it did. Either way, if the forces had been concentrated in the wrong place, they could have recovered the position. As it was the worst possible start to get off in defence of their position. The movement, anyway, was tracked throughout the night by British reconnaissance units, but bizarrely there was very little British reaction to their reports. Messervy of 7th Armoured claimed he had received instructions to make no move. Lumsden, 1st Armoured, believed the main thrust was likely to come through the centre of the Gazala line and refused to go to the assistance of Messervy's division, which was caught unawares and still in the process of forming up, and driven off its prepared defensive positions. Nevertheless, by the evening of the 27th, Rommel's forces were trapped against the minefields at the 150 Brigade box. You can see more or less in the middle, and they were trapped between the Brigade box and its minefields, and between the armoured units that had managed to sort of coalesce more or less in the centre where it says 22nd Armoured Brigade on the map. Rommel's desperate situation, short of petrol and ammunition and cut off from further supplies, was saved by the Italian Trieste Division, which had gone astray on the first night and worked its way directly through the British minefields, bringing a lifeline to Rommel. It was therefore a question of eliminating him before he eliminated the Northumbrian Brigade, and in this, 8th Army failed completely. once he had eliminated the Northumbrian Brigade, it was only a matter of time before the Panzer Army was able to concentrate its full strength on the rest of the British boxes, attacking at Bir Hakeim and then turning on the remaining armour at Knightsbridge and defeating it in a 2-day battle. At no time was the British command able to find a solution to this remorseless process. A counterstroke by the infantry was proposed, but neither Gott nor Norrie wished to be responsible for it. A plan to drive south, then west and north, and to attack the Panzer Army from the rear, following in reverse the course of the Panzer Army's advance, was discussed and abandoned, and an infantry attack in the centre of the German position was launched with no overall commander and ended in disaster and recriminations, sowing among the infantry and artillery distrust not just of the leadership but of the entire armoured corps. The brigade commander wrote a devastating report mentioning the uncompromising contempt with which his battalions regarded 22nd Armoured Brigade's failure to support them, and highlighting the lack of mutual understanding and of common doctrine, which extended beyond the failure of tanks and infantry to understand each other. Next slide, please.
And just to kind of sum up there, bad deployment of the positions in the first place, indecision when you need to make a decision, lack of support amongst the units, lack of communication among the units. I mean, this is highlighting all that is inherently wrong with the 8th Army at this point. Is it's going back to what John Parshall said a week ago, is that the ingredients are there. They've got armor, they've got artillery, they've got infantry. They just can't get it working together and singing off the same hymn sheet. And when you read it as you'd have just done there, it's amazing to think that we are including this discussion in a week or 2 weeks about what was eventually an Allied victory, because at this point in time it's hard to see there's going to be a victory ahead of this for the Allies, because it's a real display of ineptitude on many levels, isn't it?
It's extraordinary. You missed out also the wireless insecurity.
Yeah, well, the wireless security as well.
You've listened to all the British plans, broadcast free in the charge. But this is Ritchie with one of his orders groups. On his right is Norrie, on his left is Gott, with their senior staff officers. And this actually was picture was taken on the 30th of May, exactly when he had Rommel absolutely at his mercy. But the look, it's obviously a posed picture, but even so, it defies credibility that you can actually just run a battle and think it's blindingly obvious what you need to do, and sit there sucking your pipe and saying, well, what do you think, chaps? It just doesn't make no sense at all. It's almost criminal. Rich was an incredibly nice guy, and he was heavily, Auchinleck blamed him for everything that went wrong, which was not actually fair. It's Auchinleck's responsibility to appoint him to keep him in post, and if he wants to get rid of him, he should have got rid of him earlier. But there we go.
And it is where some of this whole tradition of everybody knows each other, everybody's got connections going back to the 30s or the 20s or even before then, and so there's a real lack of anybody wanting to kind of stand up and really haul their friends over the coals, so to speak. They're all being very loyal to each other. No one really wants to point the finger. Auchinleck obviously does after this, but among the divisional and sort of brigade level, there's just too much friendliness between these guys. Oh, we seem to have temporarily lost James there. He's got a whirly spinning circle there. Hopefully he'll come back in a minute. And he did say he had a problem with his connection early on today, but I'm sure James will come back in there. But I'll keep on talking while he's not there. Just to remind you, folks, we've got David Brock Katz is coming on tomorrow to talk about the South African division. He'll be talking about this leadership that James mentioned there, where they've got previous prejudices of British command and what have you. And that'll be really great. And then on Monday, we've got our summary show where John Parshall, Zita, and Peter Caddick Adams are coming on to discuss the lessons learned or the lessons not learned from the North African campaign going into 1943. So that will be next week. And then I'm taking a few days off because I'm going to go and visit Dr. Philip Blood in Germany. We're going to go to Ark, and then we're going to carry on with our Sino-Japanese war. So James has dropped out. I'm hoping he'll come back in again. I will just keep on talking until he comes back. But again, I will hold up the book and just remind you that it is a really, really good book, and it's a very good accompanying book to Alan Allport's work, Browned Off and Bloody Minded. Because if you are watching this and you are not British, or even if you are British but want to understand how our class system was impacting things back in this period, it goes through that whole thing, as James explained there, the schoolhouse system, the competition between houses, the competition between schools, that seems to create a good recipe for leadership. In the end, ends up with these officers who perhaps aren't very good at what they do. So it's a really good book. I really, really recommend you go there and get it, and along with the books of the other my guests in these 2 weeks. But I'll just keep on talking until James comes back in there. I haven't managed to run out of things to say yet. While we're waiting, if you're new to the channel, don't forget to click subscribe, click the little bell so you receive notifications, and all the information you need is in the description of the show at the bottom of the page, so you can find the links to my guests' books and so on and so forth. And we're just going to wait for James to come back in now. I said Paul, but I'm Paul. I'm still here. So yes, Andreas, we are going to the Hurtgen. If you want to come and join us for a day, let us know. We're not sure we're going to be there, but we'll be there. We're going to go to Ark, and we're going to go to Remagen as well. I haven't ever been to Remagen, see the bridge there. That'd be really cool, or the remains of the bridge, I should say. So yeah, just hoping for James to come back in, because it's really good. And as Phil was saying, we're running an old boys battlefield tour, so there'll be lots of discussion about World War II, with a bit of beer and some fart and willy jokes probably as well, if that isn't too inappropriate to say. But yeah, we'll just wait for James to come back in, and really good. And yeah, I think they're the British versus the Peter principle. There's a lot of that in 8th Army at this point, where people have gone a little bit too high up the chain of command, a little bit of a lack of checking that people are qualified for the jobs they're being given. Too many people know each other, and an inability to kind of to take the blame on and show each other up for their failings they obviously were experiencing there. So I'll just keep on keep filling in till he gets back here. It's here he comes. There we go. James seems to be back. There we are. We're back. I was just filling in without you. I was just beginning to run out of things to say. But we're good now. But it was good. So where were we? We were the repercussions and Richie and what have you.
The dysfunction, basically. Really.
We were talking about dysfunction when your internet connection failed. There's an irony there that we won't explore.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've probably sort of seen enough of Richie and Norrie. I was just going to say, actually, Norrie and Gott were incredibly good friends socially as well, and Norrie actually remarried and remarried the woman that Gott really wanted to marry. So you know they were that close. It's anyway. Moving on.
Moving on. Yeah.
Yep. Right. Well, the retreat was comically badly conducted. They tried to make a stand at Mercy-Matruh. Richie was in charge. He had an incredibly elaborate operation planned. A Cannes kind of operation. He had a couple of divisions in Mercy-Matruh on the coast, the Armour Division, and the remnants of the Armour Division, and another, and the New Zealanders on the inland flank. The weak centre. His idea was the Germans would drive in through the weak centre, and then the two British wings would crack them like nutcrackers. It worked about as well as one would expect. And Auchinleck and Dorman-Smith flew up, sacked Richie, and replaced him. Dorman-Smith in the aircraft on the way up handed Auchinleck a copy of Little Hart's book, The Strategy of the Indirect Approach, subtitled How to Win Wars, and suggested that Auchinleck might find it useful as he was conducting the battle. Auchinleck said, "I don't think I'll have time for much reading." But there we go. Anyway, they arrived back at the Alamein position. Norrie has been sacked already, largely because there are no tanks left for him to general. He actually does an extremely good job bringing in retreating troops and sending them to positions along the sort of 40 or 50 mile sort of gap land bridge between the sea on the top and the Kotara depression at the bottom. And he does distribute them quite successfully. the the German troops arriving piecemeal, just as the British were arriving backwards piecemeal, are as exhausted as the British, extremely short of fuel, very, very low in numbers. They have probably about 30 or 40 tanks left. Their 90th Light Division, their assault infantry, are down to a reinforced battalion strength, about 1,000 men. Rommel says, go for it, let's get through. Once we're through here, we've got Alexandria and Egypt at our mercy. Norrie persuades the South Africans, being as awkward as always, to actually put a brigade into the Alamein box, which is the only prepared defences. And between El Alamein and the Matera Ridge, I think that's how you pronounce it, that was the obvious channel for the Germans to break through. They just about managed to halt them, mostly through artillery fire. The British artillery has been developing throughout the war, and they've actually, at this stage, they developed a highly effective form of concentrating all the 72 guns of an infantry division and working them as a single battery with devastating effects. They call it the 72 gun battery technique. It works like a dream. It's the first time it's been employed in action. So that particular gap between the Matera Ridge and the sea is closed. Just in front of the Matera Ridge, there was on the southern pass of the Matera Ridge, Norrie has, against orders, put in a defensive box. He installed an infantry brigade there. They hold out for a day and a half. They knock out a third of Rommel's tanks. The Dorman Smith's comment, as when the box finally, the news came that it had been overrun, was, "Thank God that's the last of the bloody boxes," was Dorman Smith's comment, which shows perhaps just how out of touch with sentiment he was. There follows about 4 weeks of ding-dong battles in the area. You can make a big thing about it and say that Rommel was pushing for victory, and you can say it was a wonderful defensive victory on the other side. In fact, it's just a shambles. It's pretty indiscriminate fighting. Most of the operations went wrong. One or two of them would hit any headlines. It was, you can look at it either as a missed opportunity to destroy Rommel and his army, or as a gallant and successful defence that laid the foundations for the success in October and November.
And which do you think it is? And which do you, I'm putting you on the spot, which do you think it is, James?
It's a shambolic score draw.
Yeah.
Say much more than that, but it did illustrate everything that was wrong with the British Army. It's all its existing faults were duplicated yet again. It's in fact, the army displays a level of dysfunction. Almost every one of its offensive operations miscarried. At 8th Army level, hasty planning, inadequate time for preparation, overly complex operations. At corps level, poor coordination between formations that had never previously worked together. Norrie was sacked on the 5th of July. He always claimed he resigned after he had a row with Lumsden, who, as Dorman Smith described, had become overexcited and emphatically undisciplined. And by the 8th of July, the Afrika Korps was working its way round the southern flank when he was forced to go, the bottom arrow there, when he was forced to go to the help of the Italians who were holding the northern flank at Tel Elisa. The Australians gained and held the Elisa Ridge, which was absolutely essential to maintaining a position on the coast road. And while the Rommels and the Dorman Smiths of this world thought in terms of exciting wide manoeuvres, the direct approach along the road was without question the way where Rommel should have concentrated all his forces and driven straight down there. He hadn't got the fuel, the numbers, or the men to actually make a wide encircling move, which is what Dorman Smith and Little Hart would have suggested. Dorman Smith, the fighting culminated with a really quite dreadful disaster along the Matera Ridge, when an entire brigade of recently arrived armour was ordered to advance in a hopeless operation against the entire anti-tank strength of the Panzer Army. They lost 96 out of 104 tanks. Ordered the attack, saying we've got to do something. Dorman Smith commended the attack, saying it was worth, as he put it, post-war, sacrificing a few obsolete tanks to actually make a significant gesture. So it ended in a stalemate, but it did. If the British had succeeded in capturing the Material Ridge and holding it, the Battle of Alamein would have been really quite run on different lines. That ridge was the dominant feature in Montgomery's advance and provided the greatest difficulty in surmounting. During the Battle of Alamein, they found moving from east to west, as soon as a tank put its turret above the crest of the ridge, it got shot up by 88mm guns standing a mile or so off. So that's, if any theme should have governed the British defence at First Alamein, holding on to that ridge should have been it. Instead, Auchinleck and Dorman Smith indulged themselves is the wrong word, but they misunderstood what was possible and launched ambitious attacks aimed at destroying Rommel's forces, which was never going to happen. They didn't have the money or the skills. Anyway, the Panzer Army recorded its own view of the British Army. It noted the slowness and clumsiness of the British High Command, the lack of initiative and tactical versatility, and no alteration in tactical planning if the battle developed in a way which had not been expected beforehand. It noted the lack of close cooperation between infantry and armour, the slowness with which tanks exploited the success gained by lorried infantry, and that though armour was used in brigade strength rather than squadron or regimental strength as in the previous year, armoured commanders had not yet mastered the art of handling larger formations with speed and manoeuvrability.
Ouch! I mean,
if
you got that as if you got that as your report card at school, you'd be being scolded by your parents for that. I mean, it's we'll get to the second Battle of Alamein shortly and Lightfoot and what have you. But at this point now, as I said, we've affirming what I said a few minutes ago, it's hard to see there's a victory coming. But before we move on, I wanted to get, because the conversations in the sidebar, people have mentioned the South Africans and the New Zealand Brigade, the Australian brigades, or the divisions, I should say. How do you think those Commonwealth troops are being led, generally, broadly speaking? I mean, you've been a bit kind of critical of the South Africans, but New Zealand division, Australian division, are they as equally affected by the British command as the British units, or are they able to kind of maintain a bit of their own kind of control with their own commander? Because I mean, I've come out of this week really with increased respect for Freiburg, for example, of the New Zealand brigade. So, what's your assessment of the Commonwealth troops?
Oh, I think the South Africans, start with them. I think their commanders were absolutely appalling. One wondered which side they were on. Dan Pienaar in particular. I think Brink, who his corps commander, had also been in a concentration camp as a small person. What they were doing on the British side, I'm not quite sure, but it verged on mutiny and treachery on occasion. The troops themselves were good. They're not terribly well trained. The infantry tended to do daylight advances in open order in First World War style, and that didn't work in the desert against machine guns and heavy artillery. But the way in which Pienaar in particular just disregarded orders, he had to be shamed into putting a brigade into the Alamein box. He said, we'll get wiped out. He basically wasn't prepared to accept casualties. I think he was a political animal, and his ambition really was to run South Africa. It would have been extraordinarily unpleasant right-wing government if he had. I think his sympathies probably were as much for the Germans as for the British. Whose side are you on? Brink, during Crusader, told Pienaar he was going to cooperate with the Guards Brigade, and Pienaar said three things I hate in this world. One is the British Army, one is the Guards, and one is fighting this war for them. So there we go. New Zealanders, I think you have to accept as being absolutely brilliant. They at this time they were pretty good everywhere else. You can't think of many occasions when the New Zealand troops failed to do the job or failed to commit themselves thoroughly to it. I think their performance is summed up by the double beast Victoria Cross that Charles Upham got, thoroughly deserved in every case. That's symbolic of the whole operation. One of the great, I mean, it was actually during one of these operations at Ruiz at Ridge that he was captured and therefore happily survived the war. And
then was treated badly by the class system. I think he ended up at Colditz, didn't he? And was treated badly there. But
I didn't know. I
think so. I think I read that the other day, but it doesn't surprise me at all that he ends up becoming victim to the club. But that's a rabbit hole we're going down. But
well, they were colonial troops and considered a cut below the average, sort of upper middle class, snobbish British officer, I'm afraid. My father was out there. He didn't like the Australians at all, and he didn't actually see them in action. But that was on a personal level. The Australians were extremely brash, extremely loud. I think every other word was an F word, I think, probably. And that wasn't my father's cup of tea at all. But their performance equally, I think, certainly here at the Tel Elisa Ridge, that was the definitive success for the British Army at the First Battle of Alamein, and they held on to it against very, very, very strong counterattacks. The Germans threw absolutely everything at it to get it back, because breaking through up there was the only real sort of chance of getting a victory. And equally, they performed absolutely outstandingly during the Battle of Alamein as well. I missed the episode of that, but I've read huge amounts on it, and there's some rather good novels published when I was a kid about that as well, which I devoured as they came out.
Brilliant.
And so you can't speak high enough of them. Oh, here we are. Eric Dorman Smith and Brooke. Churchill and Brooke were getting more and more disconcerted by what was happening. They realized changes need to be made. Brooke said he was going to go out and see. Much to his horror, Churchill said, "I'm coming with you, and I'll go on to Moscow and talk to Stalin." Brooke was a member of the Northern Irish Protestant ascendancy. Dorman Smith was a sort of Catholic Irishman. They did not get on at all well. Brooke actually could see straight through Dorman Smith, I think, and Dorman Smith was terrified of Brooke. You can see he is there, actually. He's not actually that he's actually shaking, poor chap, but he knows he's going to be sacked. And Brooke was not pleased when Auchinleck appointed him as his chief of staff in the field, as he put it, and organising all the counterattacks at First Alamein. So let's move on. There's Churchill with Auchinleck. Churchill inspected Auchinleck's staff. He was very, very unimpressed by the setup there. He looks pretty angry and aggressive, I think. There's an optimistic smile on Auchinleck's face, but I don't think Churchill's come up with any particular witticisms there. He's very upset at the conditions that the staff of 8th Army were working in the desert, in a tent in a wire cage full of flies, apparently. He said, take that wire cage down and let all those poor flies out, which is quite a good sort of instant joke. But changes had to be made. It had to be a new field commander for the army. The candidates basically were Gott, who charmed everybody yet again. Whether he would have worked out or not is very much open to question. Michael Carver, who later became chief of the general staff, was Gott's principal staff officer at this time, and he reports back that Gott was determined not to fight a bloody battle up in the north against the Mediterranean Sea, but to organise a vast sweeping movement around south of the Qatar Depression, involving hundreds of miles of travel. It would have been logistically most unfeasible. Gott, in fact, charmed Churchill and overcame Brooke's doubts and flew back to Cairo for 3 days' leave before taking up command of 8th Army. His plane was shot down, he was killed, and Churchill and Brooke summoned the British candidate, who happened to be Montgomery, who made his name in training in the UK. He was flown out. He and Auchinleck did not get on at all. They had history there. Auchinleck is then also decided that Auchinleck should depart to smooth things over, and Alexander was brought in to replace him. Alexander got on incredibly well with Churchill, very much Churchill's cup of tea. He also got on extremely well with Montgomery because he did what Montgomery told him.
Yeah,
So you lasted a happy team at the top. He didn't get on too well with quite a lot of the officers out there. Lumsden in particular couldn't face him. He brought Lees out to command the infantry corps in place of Norrie. Norrie had been either sacked or resigned, it wasn't clear which. But he said one, the papers say another. Lees was a great admirer of Monty and was an excellent corps commander and later army commander under him. Next slide. Montgomery arrives, wears this rather foolish-looking hat, wears quite a variety of rather foolish-looking hats, and gets a certain amount of stick for it. Here they are. They're at point 102 on the Alamein Ridge. Montgomery is actually planning the Battle of Alamein there. Horrocks is basically his corps commander who's going to run the battle. Roberts is in charge of 22nd Armoured Brigade, the sole remaining battle-worthy brigade of the British Army. It's got about 120, 130 tanks, largely Grant's actually, which does help. And there's the guy nearest the camera is one of Montgomery's aides, and the guy who's obscured by the guy nearest the camera is Erskine, who's a very, very able staff officer and is working under Horrocks.
Yeah. And a question for you, which I realize could be a potential rabbit hole, is that Montgomery's arrival, is it revolution or evolution? I mean, would the 8th Army have managed to find its way out of its problems without Montgomery's involvement? Could anybody have done it? Was it on its way to changing anyway, or was it a lot of it down to Montgomery?
Well, I think everything was down to Montgomery, actually. I mean, the equipment was coming in, the Sherman tanks were coming in, the mine clearing apparatus, the artillery, the reinforcements, they obviously were all coming in. But what he did change without any question at all was the outlook of the people there. I've got something, if I don't mind, let me turn on a page or two. Actually, just a week or so ago, a friend sent me a poem, which doesn't often happen. Actually, a very nice lady. Her grandfather was in North Africa. He served with the Royal Dragoons, and he wrote quite a long poem. In fact, I'll read you just the final verse, which counts it. It's dated 10th of July, 1942, Alamein. And the final of it has about 4 or 5 verses outlining the sort of mess they're in. Then the last verse is, let some strong man from out the British race gather up the reins, take part and set the pace. We are his minions and will follow steadfast true. But, Christ alive, let's cease this muddling through.
Wow.
I mean, it's not great verse, but it's impassioned.
Yeah, it's not going to win any poetry awards, but it's pretty blunt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I think that's what Montgomery brought. Actually, it's what people wanted, and he fitted the bill absolutely perfectly. Well, we were coming up to Alamein.
Yeah, I'll put the map
right,
up. Yeah.
There we go. Well, the British Army by this stage has been reduced to a single armoured and battle-worthy armoured brigade. That's 22nd Armoured Brigade on the point of Alamein Ridge at point 102, the point where those pictures of Montgomery were taken. They're under strict instructions to stay in their dug-in positions together with their anti-tank guns, and as is every other unit there. No one is to move a muscle, especially in retreat. But they've sussed out exactly what Rommel is likely to do. The Air Force is up to speed. It absolutely blasts Rommel in his advance through the defensive line. They lose quite a lot of equipment. The advance is put back by about 6 or 8 hours. They arrive at Alam Halfa too late in the day to do a great deal, and they basically sit there for 48 hours, being pummeled by artillery and the RAF. One novice regiment, the Scots Greys, in fact, has just come in to 22nd Armoured Brigade. They get a bit chewed up because they they're keen to get into the fight. They advance at an inopportune moment. And other than that, the Alam Halfa is a very, very solid defensive success. And Rommel retreats back. He makes the most of a bad job by absorbing the British minefields as his own. So he gains a bit of territory, and that does make life difficult when the British do advance in October. But the point about Alam Halfa is that it's a success, and it's undoubted success, and nobody can dispute that. We're rushing on a bit now. During the opening stages of the Battle of Alamein, as it was, the news comes in on the second night, on the night of the 24th, 25th, that the progress isn't so good. The armour is very, very sticky. The infantry haven't quite got through. Lumsden, here in the cap, tall chap in the cap on the right, says we can't do it. It's not going to work. Montgomery is woken up at 3 in.the.morning and told the situation is pretty serious. Lumsden and his divisional commander Gatehouse come to meet him. He says, "Well, you've got to do it. You've got to get through." And this is a photograph I found in the Imperial War Museum. It's dated 25th October 1942, so it's that morning after the broken night's sleep. Lumsden standing, looking fairly stiff and sort of unreceptive. On the left is Lees, the infantry commander, who doesn't have a lot of time for the armoured units. He thinks they actually are quite happy to see the not quite happy, but would rather their recalcitrance and lack of drive, as he sees it, simply puts casualties on the infantry, and that can't go on being supported. It's militarily nonsensical. And he's got, if you like, a slightly aggressive stance. Montgomery there is in the middle, and what he's thinking is difficult to tell. He's not showing any emotion whatsoever. Confronted with a very powerful personality like Lumsden, he's totally unabashed. He's just, you can see him kind of considering, do I get rid of this guy? Do I force him to go on? What is the solution? And by and large, he drives them on. I think it's quite a revealing photograph. Perhaps one's reading far too much into it, but it speaks to me.
No, there's definitely a sense of confidence. I mean, I noticed that earlier on that posed photo with the pipes and the maps, it all looked a little bit, what do you suggest doing kind of thing. Whereas this looks like a bit more that there is Montgomery certainly looks like he knows what he's doing. I mean, again, I may be interpreting too much in it, but I don't know. I think there's more in that, but yeah.
If you could go back to the second photograph of Montgomery on Alam Halfa Ridge.
Is that the next one or the previous?
Oh, the previous one. There we are. This one here. In the previous one, he's wearing his hat, which doesn't actually suit him at all. He looks a bit of a dick in that hat. And here he's got fed up with it. He's ripped it off, and he's actually galvanized his little orders group. Everybody's apart from Roberts, who's starting the maps. The other three are absolutely sort of galvanized by his gesture. It's leadership, not in the Rommel style exactly, but at least there's a physical dynamism there.
When I had Craig Tibbets on talking about the Australians last week, and he used a photo of Montgomery wearing the slouch hat, and he said in a very typically Australian sort of sarcastic voice, "We were really pleased when he stopped wearing it." It was just so scathing in its understated. We was really pleased when he stopped wearing it. So I think in the end the beret was the wiser choice, but.
There we go.
But yeah, we should get to Lightfoot, I suppose. Yeah.
Yes, here we are. I think can I actually excuse me on this one really and say I agree entirely with John Partial. If you can't do combined tactics, just get a lot of artillery. But Lightfoot but it actually sort of stems from the fact that Montgomery had actually galvanized everybody to make not superhuman, but efforts they didn't believe they would make. The systems for clearing the minefields, the mine detectors themselves just being invented in time, the creative use of artillery, but destructive use of artillery, but the determination with which novice troops advanced. The Australians had a bit of experience. The Scots, nonetheless, got almost all their objectives on the first night. South Africans lingered behind a bit. The Indians weren't really involved. New Zealand's, they'd had one of their infantry brigades completely wiped out, thanks to Dorman Smith and Auchinleck in July. They'd been given an armoured brigade to play with instead, and mostly of novice troops, actually. That worked incredibly well in the end. Very heavy casualties on the first night, and they were withdrawn, they were reformed, they were given rested a bit, re-equipped, confidence was restored, chucked back into it for the breakthrough, and it worked. Again, very heavy casualties, but they remained in being as a unit. The 22nd Armoured Brigade, which was the longest-serving armoured brigade around there, full of all the old people who've been there since the beginning of the war. They were shipped down south to the subsidiary sector, and the wonderful character called Sergeant Wardrop of the 5th Royal Tanks, which you may have come across. His diaries were published some years ago, and he said, "Well, we still had our grants for breaking down all the time. They wouldn't give us the Shermans because they thought we were too cunning to use them properly." And cunning by that time had come to mean keep your head down a bit, mate, and let's get out of here if we possibly can after we've done our job. In fairness, it was after they'd done their job generally, but the most experienced troops, 7th Armoured Division, were put down in the south on a subsidiary role. They had a night and a half of very heavy fighting on the first day when they were acting as a diversionary force, and then after that they were pulled back, and the mobile units were actually pulled back up to the north and used to exploit in the final days of the Alamein battle. And that's probably the job they need to do. They had a very, very good new commanding officer, general commanding, Harding. Is a young and extremely able man. He became chief of the general staff in the 50s. And he made his name. He'd already made his name, but he certainly continued his reputation as being a brilliant trainer and commander with the 7th Armoured Division. So, what else is there to say?
We just got this one photo to discuss, and then we can. And I think I'd be intrigued as well as what the Germans thought as well, because we've talked about Montgomery making his improvements to the 8th Army, but the Germans are now encountering, or the Axis, I should say, are now encountering a newly led army. What was their reaction? This is the famous meeting with General von Thoma there. So, what was the Germans' assessment of Lightfoot and Supercharge?
Well, the Ultra by this time was pretty good. He was listening to all the German reports back to Berlin, and by and large, copies of that got onto Montgomery's desk in the morning. About the same time, they got onto Hitler's. And they found the weight of artillery fire insupportable. Basically, It was wiping out entire units. It was after the first couple of days, by the time Rommel had got back, they were seriously worried. They'd actually, before it started, they were actually full of confidence, and they had their minefields. They had the British minefields where they captured quite a lot at the dying days of the Alamein battle. They'd improved a lot. They had some really nasty mines there. They had from aircraft bombs to the shoe mines that leapt up and exploded at just below waist height. And so they were pretty confident. They were fairly sure that if they needed to counterattack, they could actually wipe out the British armour. They had no great respect for it. They were unpleasantly surprised at actions like Snipe, for example. They lost 40 or 50 armoured vehicles there. Again, Brits lose a battalion, but that sounds like quite a good exchange for the day. And that sort of attrition worked extremely well. It was an attritional battle. It didn't get it. Maneuverability was not key. It was extremely well planned and extraordinarily well carried out. Again, particularly by the Australians and the New Zealanders, and by the troops that are attached to them. The pursuit was a bit of a cock up, but it was who was to blame is not at all clear. Personally, I would like to blame Lumsden. Leave everything on his head. I think he was quite keen to be first through and quite competitive. And to make it. He's a very ambitious man. And I think he sort of screwed things up as much as anybody did. But it wasn't that bad a screw up. The Germans fought extraordinarily hard in the final days to actually halt the breakthrough, and Hitler's no retreat order had only limited effect. It made Rommel pause, but he'd received permission to retreat again very short, almost as soon as he actually had already decided to retreat. It's after that, the timing. Montgomery had forecast 12 days for the duration of the battle. That's exactly what it was. He forecast 13,000 casualties, and it was 12.5, something like that. It was. It actually. It's kind of unsound to say it went according to plan, because you can't plan for the death of 10,000 men plus. But the fact that he actually could guess on the basis of experience, I think is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, no, and in many ways, this is validating, because there was a bit of feedback about John Parshall's show that he was overly critical of the British and because he's American, and someone said that because he teaches at the U.S. Naval Staff College, then he must be like Admiral King and hate the English and hate the British, and which is nonsense. But the thing is to have come from such a poor position, just weeks basically before the second battle of Alamein, the British 8th Army was still in dire straits with so many of its flaws being exposed. We went through the communications, tank infantry cooperation, etc., 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 and then to come through and even get a flawed victory, which clearly at Alamein was not an absolutely knocking out of the park, convincing victory, but it was a victory, and it brought about a change in optimism, a change in belief. So I think it's an amazing turnaround, really. And also because so many of the ideas we talked about the ideas of concentrations of artillery were taken on to Normandy and beyond. The tactical air power was taken on to Normandy and beyond. So really, really important. But we'll do a couple of questions if you've got time. So Ian Carr is asking, did the British have a similar senior officer clear out on the other fronts following this episode? Burma seemed to improve under Slim. So anyone kind of come to mind?
Yeah, there was a bit of a clear out along with Auchinleck. Messervy went. He was an Indian Army officer anyway. He went out to India, and he did quite well in charge of an infantry division. He sounds a bit of a prat at times, actually. He was always, when he's on campaign, he always got into his pajamas at night, and he thought that impressed the troops. It showed how calm he was. He was caught in his pajamas by the Japanese, actually, and had to retreat rather quickly there. He lost his red banded hat, and eventually somebody killed the Japanese sergeant who had it in his possession and gave it back to him. But he's a bit of a plonker, I think, in some respects, but no great harm otherwise. Who else went out? McCreary went out. McCreary had come in, actually, as an armoured advisor. He was posted in by Brooke in the spring of 1942, much to Auchinleck's fury. McCreary was the ultimate, seriously upper class, moneyed family, quite professional, but very much a cavalryman. And he sort of saw cavalry as being sacrosanct, and the cavalry regiments, the idea that some of them should be amalgamated when they'd suffered losses, filled him with horror. I mean, you can't have Scots Greys alongside the 11th Hussars in the same tank, he thought. So he was promoted to be chief of staff to Alexander, and I think he did very well in that role. But on the whole, there wasn't a sort of punishment parade of officers who were deemed to have failed. A lot had been sacked by Auchinleck. Who else? There was Tuke had come and gone. He went out. He'd come back, hadn't he? He was in charge of 4th Indian Division.
4th Indian, yeah. And Al Murray really rates Tuka. I'm trying to persuade Al to come on and do a show about Tuka and the 4th Indian Division, because although they weren't involved in the Second Battle of Alamein, particularly, they're on the fringe of that. Their earlier exploits, I think, had singled them out as being a pretty formidable unit. Yeah. We've got one more question from Gary there, because then we will bring things to an end. Do you agree with Rommel that geography had something to do with the British success in that it accentuated British superiority in material, especially artillery, and lessened German advantages in mobile warfare?
Well, I mean, geography's always got something to do with somebody's success. I don't think geography in Alamein really counted for very much, except it narrowed the front on which the Germans had to defend. So in that sense, it probably helped the Germans. In fact, there's only a sort of 30-40 mile gap. The ridges, the Material Ridge, then the Ruizat Ridge, although they're marked with quite considerable definition on maps, they're incredibly shallow. They really are. And they're not they're accessible in almost everywhere. They're not like the escarpments around Tobruk, for example, which they probably helped the Germans in that the Germans actually held the Material Ridge, and as soon as a British tank poked its nose over the top, it got blasted. It was skylined immediately. So I wouldn't have thought really it helped. There are no rivers to canalize an attack. There are no sort of forests to impede vehicle movement. The going generally was fairly good. It was a bit sticky in the south, and some units advancing in the Alam Halford battle. Some German units advancing got a bit stuck in the sand, but that was just a hazard. Really, it happened all the time. The fact that the bit of geography that I think really matters was the Teaser Mound that the Australians captured. That was absolutely essential. And it gave them a vantage point. It reduced the chance of a German breakthrough up north. And there was quite a useful ridge for the Germans as well at Akakia, if that's how you pronounce it, which they provided a good sort of final defensive position for the German rearguard. So there we are. It's geography. Yeah.
Well, I think we will bring things to an end. It's nice to keep shows to under 90 minutes. They seem to do better in repeat viewings if they're not too long. So I'll just bring you back up on screen. Well, it's been an extraordinary debut performance. There's been a couple of requests to have you back in a future episode. I liked your.
I found it hard to believe.
No, I liked the last chapter of your book where you go through and talked about the tank types and the Matilda and the Crusader and cruisers and infantry support and guns. That would be an interesting episode. But no, your scholarly understanding of this battle has shone through, so it's been really good. So,
thank you very much. I'm sorry it was so messy.
It wasn't messy at all. I've had more things go wrong than this in shows. I've had connections with things. It's all part of the charm. It's all part of the charm of doing it live. It's been great talking.
Ask you for their money back?
No, it's all this. How can you ask for your money back when it's free? I mean, that's the thing. This is a free channel, so it's
a trick question.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, anyway, thank you, James, and thank everybody for watching. And folks, I will see you all again tomorrow evening when we have David on talking about the South African division, which will round off this week. Then we have our panel discussion on Monday. So, cheers, everybody. This is Paul Bedard for World War II TV and James Colvin saying enjoy the rest of your day. This is see you next day. Bye.
Bye-bye.